What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and today returning to the podcast is Rolf Jacobson. He's a dean at Luther Seminary, psalm scholar. He wrote the Homebrewed Christianity guide to the Old Testament, and he's a good friend of mine. And I'm so pumped to have a conversation with him that gets this intimate and personal. His new book, which he wrote with two people. I don't want to ruin the story because he's going to tell it to us. But I just want to say this book brings some of the greatest gifts the Hebrew scriptures can bring, and the Lutheran theology of the cross can give to people in the midst of suffering. It is not just intimate in the stories of the friends that write the book, but it brings the kind of insights you get as all three of them have been wrestling with Scripture, not just academically, but as people of faith and leaders in the church. And the gift of naming God's presence in our suffering and what that gift brings is really, it's at the heart of the gospel, but it is transparently thick in this book. I've given it to friends since I got to read it and write a little endorsement, and Rolf and I had a wonderful conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. And just so you know, look, this is how good this is. Look, it's a great book. Rolf and I are great friends. Then when this thing went off, we talked for like another hour and a half and argued about the things we disagree on with verbosity. And that's one of the reasons I love Rolf. Both of us understand that arguing in nerd speak about religion and politics and all sorts of things like that is a sign of affection. So on top of the quality of the book, the beautiful presentation, I just love the person, Rolf. He led the pop-up choir at Theology Beer Camp last year in St. Paul, and it was amazing. Anyway, here's my buddy, Rolf Jacobson, who's also a podcaster, does a narrative lectionary podcast through Luther Seminary. You could check that out, especially if you're a lectionary preacher. All right, here we go. Hello, everyone. This is Trip. Returning to the podcast is Rolf Jacobson. And Rolf, you got a new book. God Meets Us in Our Suffering. And it is very different than an academic text on the Psalms. It's not as funny as a book directly on humor, though I will say there's plenty of jokes in it, some of which I don't think I have permission to say. But you can bring them up if you... Well, you know.
Hey, it's published. It's... Okay, by the way, thank you. It's great to be back, Trip. It's great to be back. Thank you for the invitation and for people to think about the book God Meets Us in Our Suffering, which is a laugh-out-loud, heartwarming tale of disease, disability, and death.
It's true. That is an excellent description of the book.
That's my summary of the book.
And unlike a lot of books, most people, when they write a book with others and it involves memoir, don't put in the preface that they spent years arguing to their brother, who's a co-author, that they're against cancer memoirs. And so if people have ever had the chance to hang out with both of you, your relationship is featured through it, and it's exactly it. You both of your voices just pop in the book. But for those that never got a chance to hang out with your brother, I'd love for you to introduce us to you and Mike and Carl by helping us understand the backstory that set up three individuals sharing their stories and wrestling with their own suffering and facing cancer, and then the humor and friendship and the my favorite phrase y'all use throughout it is the side by side bit. Quality material.
Yeah, well, so to back up, the book God Meets Us in Our Suffering is the story of three close friends, me, my brother Carl, and our dear friend Mike Pancoast. The three of us wrote this book together, that we all had cancer and went through it together, sort of. And the way I say sort of is I'm now 60 years old, but I had cancer when I was 15. And long story short, I had both of my legs amputated and they saved my life. Then that was 1980 through 83. My brother is 5 years younger than me, and his good buddy and my good buddy a year older than Carl. So they're 4 and 5 years younger than me. January 2022, Mike was diagnosed with lymphoma. And as he was diagnosed formally with lymphoma, he was with me and my brother and my dad up at my dad's cabin in northern Minnesota. So Mike is there, and it's very clear he has cancer, but we don't know. And Carl, my brother, wasn't feeling all that great on that weekend trip that my dad and Carl and Mike and I are. And so we were all like, Carl, you gotta go to the doctor. And this is still a little bit sort of post-COVID. So Carl did some online stuff with a doctor, video visits. So maybe all of us have become used to since then. And then a couple weeks later, it was like midweek morning, and I'm getting the oil change in my car, and Carl calls me. His wife was in Washington State, and we live in Minnesota. And he goes, I need you to take me to the emergency room right now. That they say I can't drive because of my health. So I drop everything and I pick him up and take him to the hospital. And by noon, we know he's got leukemia. So then for the next year and a half, especially the two of them were actively fighting cancer. My cancer was a distant memory. The two of them went through cancer side by side, literally together. And then I was invited in as someone who had already had it and was close to both of them. And there's many actually very brilliant Christian leaders, pastors, theologians who have written about their struggles with faith and life going through cancer. Kate Bowler's book, her brilliant book, Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I Have Loved. Deanna Thompson's book, Hoping for More, Jason Micheli, there's lots of them. So I've been approached many times in the 45 years since I was diagnosed and then as a pastor and theologian. Would you write a book about this? And I've always said, no, I wouldn't do it. But then when Carl was declared cancer-free in June of 2024, and he said, hey, I've started the manuscript for a book about us. And I said, no, Carl, we're not doing this. And then he said, no, here's what's different. This is not a cancer memoir. It's 3 people going through it together, side by side by side. And then he had mapped it out. And I thought, okay, this is different. I think we could do this. And so then in a burst of energy in the month after he was diagnosed as cancer-free, we got roughly 3 chapters written, and it was just going great. And then a month after he was diagnosed cancer-free, he had leukemia, and the bone marrow transplant that saved his life knocked his immune system back. And then so a month later, because his immune system was compromised by the cure. So, right, the cure for leukemia is a bone marrow transplant, but that also knocks your immune system down. And then meningitis attacked his brain and put him into a coma, and he died a month later in 2024. And then that gave me a burst of emotional energy. So then I wrote with Mike the next 3 chapters. And so when I say it's a heartwarming, laugh out loud tale of disease, disability, and death, it is. Carl died, the saddest thing of my life. The purpose of the book is that even in suffering, we can find that God meets us, and even suffering is an opportunity to fall more deeply in love with God.
One of the things that you mentioned there about not being attracted to the project until Carl shared the idea of it not being like one person's story, but the 2 of you brothers, but then, like 3 of you as friends. And I wonder if it was a story of 3 people who have a long life of relationship and friendship. Like, what made that more attractive? Because it seemed in the book that it was the kind of threading of all 3 of your experiences that gave a context for what is one of the more beautiful descriptions of a theology of the cross. And in the relationship and of y'all's stories, there's a kind of a thickness to one of those really beautiful aspects of Luther's thought that, is often not understood outside of those, familiar with Luther.
When we set out to write the book, we did not know, I did not know we were writing a book about the theology of the cross. The theology of the cross is a phrase that Luther used in his early theology and then he quit using, but then it was retrieved about 100 years ago, and it's become very popular among non-Lutherans too, like Douglas John Hall and others. So the question is, well, what is the theology of the cross? What does that mean? So that's a whole set. That's a whole set. We didn't know we were writing a book. We thought we were writing a three-person. What did we learn, and what can other people learn from our story? That suffering is part of the Christian life. Not choosing to suffer, like I'm going to be like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and choose to suffer, or the Desert Fathers. I'm going to choose a life of suffering. But no, I didn't choose this. It chose me. What am I going to do now? So that's a whole set of conversations. So let's talk about the theology of the cross for a minute. Paul in First Corinthians and in Philippians especially, he starts off and says, okay, you all are such a mess in Philippi and in Corinth. We need to go back to some basic Christian teachings. And both in Corinth, when he talks about in First Corinthians, the word of the cross, the logos to staru, in other words, the theology of the cross, logos, theologos. And in Philippians, listen all, Christ chose to humble himself even to death, even death on a cross. So the grounding, the basic Christian teaching is what happened in the cross? What does the cross reveal? That's the essential. We didn't know we were writing about that. We thought we were just telling our stories, but as we wrote them, then we realized more and more, oh, that's what this is about. We didn't know it when we started.
For me, one of the reasons the weaving of your three stories became such a fertile place for the theology of the cross, which is why the two very different directions were in my head in the question, is that of the most powerful parts of a theology of the cross is that that you can't theologize about suffering from above.
What do you mean by above? From above?
Yeah, like from some God eye view where you are apart from suffering and resurrected glory and these kinds of things, where because there's this other space, I can now just presume there's a will and authority and justification and X, Y, and Z for this. Luther has this orientation to theologize within it, right? Like the cross is the word of the cross isn't something you escape. It's something you return to. And
Yeah.
in what the friendship of you three, and obviously it's more than that for you and Carl because you're brothers, but it was like y'all's relationship became a place to think theologically from within it, from within each of your stories. But right, like you have your own story and experience of getting cancer in high school, coming back, and then a long story. But Carl has his experience of his brother getting it, and your friend, and vice versa, right? And in that kind of both perspectives of each one's journey, that theology from within, you actually get at the beautiful part of the theology of the cross, right? Which is Luther's going like, you think the correct theological answer for suffering is the Father had it all under control? Because I'm Trinitarian. Like in the very heart of God is the one who sees their son die, experiencing this abandonment, and the Father knows what it's like to go through it with their son, not solve it. And so that you each are so close to each other, and you each have your own experience, but you also have the experience of going alongside each other. Your friendship sets up for this way of doing. It's like a analogy of a Trinitarian theology of the cross, and I was just like, oh, it's way more compelling, just as a process person would like to press you on other parts of the theology of the cross, than if just one person's like, let me explain it to you. All of a sudden, it's the narratives and relationship and the texture of it, and Luther's resistance to theologize, like going, don't theologize above the suffering, theologize from within it. Boom.
Yeah, I think the key there is one of the things people like to do is we like to infer logically that from experience to, oh, cause and effect. And so, oh, so-and-so is suffering. What caused it? That's the inference. We want to infer back cause and effect. So-and-so is having a bad thing happen to them. What caused it? It must be something. Just stop there. That's the human condition. We always want cause and effect, and we want to be able to reason backwards from experience, from whatever the shit that's going on now to what caused it. So think about that in terms of the cross. Oh, you're walking by. It's 30 AD. You don't even know it's AD. It's 30 AD, though. You're walking by, and there's this naked guy on the cross. He's crying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Here, go like, and you're thinking, well, clearly God forsook that guy because he did something to deserve to be up there. I gotta get home. I gotta put my kid to bed who's hadn't had a shower today, and I gotta put that kid to bed. I don't have time to deal with this guy who's going, "Why have you forsaken me?" It's clear God forsook him. We all agree.
Whose sin was it? Was it his or his parents?
Right. The point of the cross, where an innocent man, the Son of God, was crucified, the worst death. Crucifixion was an awful way to torture and shame somebody publicly to death. And that is the absolute manifestation of the power and presence of God to save. When it looks for anyone who has a reasonable set of eyes to go, that's the absence of God and the weakness of that guy, whoever that guy is. So we like to reason backwards. Why did something happen to me or to somebody else? There must be a reason. The cross says you can't do that, because if God was present most powerfully in the absence of God, the death of God, right? If the crucifixion of Jesus is the death of the Son of God, and Christians believe that is the most present the power of God for salvation has ever been, that's the paradox of the cross. The key thing to understand is two things. God is with us in our suffering. If someone is suffering, you can't conclude God is absent. God might be present there. Therefore, you also can't reason backwards to go, oh, what happened? What happened? And so we tell the story in my book, and this is one of my favorite stories of my whole life. So when I was sick in high school, in 10th grade, I had my right leg amputated. In 11th grade, my left leg amputated because I had bone cancer in both legs, which I had, previous to that, no one had ever had it in both legs. You know, a primary example of the cancer. So the key is, this woman comes up and says to my mother, "Don't you feel guilty that Rolf has cancer?" My mom says, "I feel terrible that my son has cancer, but I don't know what you mean. Do I feel guilty?" And the woman says to her, "Well, if you'd fed your family the right diet of fresh fruits and vegetables, Rolf wouldn't have cancer." I write in the book, actually, I wrote this. My mom, who was short, my mom was, 5'3", 5'2", punched her and decked her. And a friend of mine who was reading the book, he goes, "Did your mom really punch?" I said, "Just keep reading." And the next line goes, "No, Mom didn't really punch her, but Carl and I were romantics, and so we wish she would have." And because this woman, well, she was not a bad person, but she wanted to be able to say something caused every
Wanted
form
an
of
answer to
suffering.
why.
Yes, right. We wanted an answer to why, and that's cause and effect. Something caused the why, right? And one of the best pastors I've ever known in my life, and I'm not going to say this person's name, many, many years later, said to me when he first met me, "Oh, how'd you lose your legs?" And I said, "Oh, I had cancer in high school." He goes, "Oh, did your family live close to power lines?" Again, not blaming, in this case, differently, but the idea is something had to have caused it. And my oncologist at the Mayo Clinic, who knows more about sarcoma, the disease I had, than anyone in the world. In the book, I refer to him as Dr. Sarcoma. He hasn't read the book yet, so don't tell him. Anyway, he told me the form of cancer I had absolutely is not lifestyle dependent. There's nothing, he said to me, there's nothing you or your family could have done to cause this or to decrease your chances of having experienced this. Kate Bowler, my dear friend, in her book about her own cancer, in some ways talks about this. And she says, for some reason, people have our time just saying that's awful. In my own language, I wouldn't say it that way. I would say that sucks. You know, some people can't just go, oh shit, you got cancer. That sucks. They instead have to have a reason. Oh, so the neighbor who came over to Kate's house when she was diagnosed with cancer said, I just want you to know I believe everything happens for a reason. And Kate's husband said, oh, please tell me what it is. And then he went, what? Please tell me why my wife is dying. Why is it we can't just go, oh, this sucks?
My first encounter with Luther in that sense, in the theology of the cross, was an undergrad. My grandmother had like a recurrence, and so I went to a different undergrad so I could be nearer, and she had done an experimental cancer treatment, and like your brother...
When you hit the experimental stuff, that's bad.
Yeah, but like your brother, she was cancer-free, then got pneumonia, where it's like your immune system's down, yeah. and died. And Frank Tupper, who was a Baptist theologian, that's why I went to Wake for my master's. Someone recommended his book, The Scandalous Providence. And in the chapter where the book is he wrote it coming out of, he's teaching at Southern, and his wife gets cancer, dies. And after Betty's death, he's a single dad and head of the theology faculty at Southern, and like WTF basically. And in the section on the theology of the cross, he has a line like Luther taught him that you have permission to say and perhaps scream that life is indeed arbitrary, but God's not. That's what the theology of the cross is about. And so many Christians feel the need that their response to suffering or injustice or pain or shame and these kinds of things is to go, oh, we find meaning in it by meaning that it was somehow ordained or planned or just for this to happen. And the cross is going like, no, look where God shows up. This is by definition the archetype of unjust suffering. And God meets us in our suffering, and God is for us in that suffering.
God meets us in our suffering and doesn't just go, oh, okay, I met you there. But God actually has transformative power in the midst of suffering to bring us, to give new creation and birth to whatever's next. In Carl's case, that didn't mean survival. In my case, it did, but it meant permanent disability. So you're not restored, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's complicated. It's neither full restoration to everything's good, whoop, no problems. And sometimes it's not survival, but yet there is new creation even in the midst of Carl's death.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things, and if people haven't heard our previous conversations, you're a Psalm scholar and have published quite a bit on it. And I wonder, especially thinking about the theology of the cross, and it is a kind of lens that is definitionally Christocentric, and yet Jesus is quoting a psalm on the cross. He's in many ways, like, to understand that event as a theologian of the cross is to know that you're in a tradition where you have Lamentations as sacred text. The Psalms of Lament, how do you see those connecting to the hidden God or Deus absconditus within the theology of the cross and the kind of suffering? What does Jesus not just being a single instance of something, but like within a tradition that canonizes lament and fist shaking at God. Like, how does that transform or kind of contextualize or and set the context for seeing it in a bigger way?
So I think a lot of Christianity, and this is true of all sorts of American Christianities, want to view the cross as simply about the atonement. And the cross is about the atonement. On the cross, Jesus atoned for the brokenness of the world. Absolutely. But some Christians want to go, okay, and now that he did that, we can forget about the cross. I think Paul, especially clearly in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, clearly in Romans and Philippians, is saying, no, people. The meaning of the cross is not just the atonement. It is the atonement. I'm not denying that. I'm affirming that. But Paul is saying the cross actually shows us two really important things. Number one, why human beings cannot understand God. So that's why Paul builds up in his argument in 1 Corinthians 1 and 2. He starts with the word of the cross is foolishness. And then at the end he goes, listen, if the authorities of this world had known, they would never have killed the King of Glory. So what I like to do is I help people read forward through 1 and 2 Corinthians to that. Hey, if they had known, they wouldn't have killed the King of Glory. And then read backwards, because Paul's argument is this proves you can't reason with human reasonableness based on our experience in nature and our experience of life about how God is and how God works. The only thing you can do, Paul is saying, is look at the cross where God is most powerfully absent and present simultaneously. And if you buy that, which is a lot of the world hasn't, this is why a lot of the world rejects Christianity, is because they reject the cross. It means that the cross is not only the one time of atonement, and that is true, but it's also, it marks how God is present in creation from the cross on, and actually maybe even before that in the Old Testament, is that suffering is the place where God has promised to show up. And the reason God has promised to show up in suffering is God recognizes that the brokenness of the world is a problem that God is duty bound to correct. God recognizes when Jesus cries out, hey, why have you forsaken me? God's like, yeah, I know. It wasn't supposed to be like this way. It is. And now I want to appeal to people's experience. Throughout 1 Corinthians, Paul appeals to people's experience. Hey, think about your own experience. You weren't all that hot shit, right? You were a bunch of losers before you became Christians, right? So I want to appeal to your experience as a Christian leader. And I know you're a Christian leader, Tripp, in spite of whatever people on the extremes say nasty things about you. Every Christian leader I've known has had this experience happen 100 times. A pastor would say something like this: so-and-so died, or their teenage daughter was killed in a car accident. I didn't want to go, but I had to go. And I went into the room. I was like, I got to minister to them. And then I went in, and an hour later I left, and I thought, they ministered to me. That story I've heard 1,000 times from pastors. So stop and reflect on that. If that's true, if you thought you were bringing God into a situation of absolute suffering, going into a deathbed, going into a funeral home consultation where somebody's been just tragically killed, you thought you were bringing God and you left and they brought God to you. Doesn't that tell you that God was ahead of you and that God has met us all in suffering? Seems to me pretty obvious that that's true. And that's one of the central meanings of the cross, is God meets us in our suffering, and we can't reason backwards from someone's suffering to a cause for it, especially a cause that God has cursed them. One of my colleagues, Lois Malcolm, Lois was a missionary child in the Philippines, and she has reported to me that until the Catholic missionaries got there and taught the indigenous people the Magnificat that says God is with the poor and wants to overturn the powers of creation, no one had ever told the poor that God loves them. They had reasoned backwards from their own impoverishedness. God must not love us. God must have cursed us. That's why we're poor. And the people in power are like, the reason we're in power is God has chosen us to be in power. It is divine right. Isn't that true? And everyone's like, all the powerful people are like, yep, the reason we're in power is God has chosen us. And if that, that's not true. And so what if it's true that God actually loves the poor and you can't reason back from their impoverished experience to therefore God has cursed them? That's the theology of the cross. God shows up in our suffering and you can't reason backwards from suffering to anything about God, which means the theology of the cross, which on the one hand is incredibly esoteric. God shows up at the cross means it's a paradox, blah, blah. It's the most practical of all Christian theologies because it helps us give pastoral care to people. It helps us preach. It helps people understand their own experience. So the key thing I learned from writing this book, I didn't know I was writing a book about the theology of the cross, but it's so practical and it's so simple. And that's why I think this book is the most important book I've written. I've written books with long footnotes that nobody cares about. Like one of my assistants once said to me about a footnote I was writing, goes, who are you trying to impress with that footnote? Like the four other Psalm scholars that know this verse and the complicated thing. And nobody cares. What they do care about is very concrete things. God meets us in our suffering. How should we treat people who are suffering?
That bit about that you were talking about of clergy all have these moments where they feel inadequate and then they just show up, right? And you're like, oh, okay, I managed. And then you sometimes discover like, actually you were the one being ministered to. And then you're like, oh, that was wild. And this makes me think of one of the things that, yes, the Lutherans emphasize the theology of the cross, but in many ways, our culture is like just allergic to it. We actually spend a lot of money to hide ourselves from people that are suffering, not just at end of life, or just people that are old age, or people that deal with disabilities, or people that are unhoused, or there's tons of people whose lived experience of suffering just makes us so uncomfortable that our solution is let us sanitize the world so we never encounter suffering. Or think of parents who, I experienced going from, the South to LA as a minister. And the first time I did a big funeral and there were no kids and youth there. And I'm like, where are they? And they're like, oh, well, I didn't want to introduce them to death so early. And I'm just like, okay, that's interesting. But just in one of the things that came to the way in which you focus on how presence is so imperative, way more than explanation. I think so many people after the Enlightenment think that we don't want anyone to have an experience until they can understand their correct explanation of it. And if we get uncomfortable, we're going to avoid the encounter. And I think of a theology of the cross, just like a clergy that thinks, I don't know what I'm going to do if I show up, gives us this confidence that, no, Christ is present in it. And if you're avoiding showing up where suffering happens, what are you avoiding? You're avoiding the actual place Christ has promised to show up. And that so many of the little vignettes and stories in the book kind of like bring that to the fore. Even places where we affirm the theology of the cross, we also just assume there'll be no one under 20 at the funeral. That's odd.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And several responses. One is, first of all, to recognize that if any of us, and that I include myself totally, is like, if you don't want to go to the place where people are suffering, if you're normal, that's a normal human reaction. So some of my best friends that I had before I got sick with cancer didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to say. They didn't know how to handle it. And they were just emotionally repulsed by what they assumed was my suffering. They never showed up. That was okay. And they, in today's language, they ghosted me. They just, I had friends like the day before, we were playing tennis. I was a tennis player, and bummed, never heard from them again because they didn't know what to do. That's normal. It's normal to be repulsed by somebody else's suffering. It's normal not to know what to say. And so it's also sort of normal not to go. The Christian's response is to go anyway, to accept. If I'm feeling these emotions, I don't want to go. My best friend's mother just was killed in a car accident. My best friend's parents just announced they're going to divorce. My best friend's child was just killed. What do I do? I don't want to go. Or not even my best friends, just my neighbors. You go anyway, and you say three things. You say, this sucks. I love you. Well, and then you bring some blessing, sign of blessing. The joke in the book is, and this is a story people can read the book, is I tell people to bring Cheetos. This sucks. I love you. I brought you some Cheetos. Because after all, Cheetos are the perfect food as long as nutrition is not important to you. We need to love each other. My best friends were, my mom, before she died, somebody said, what was the secret to Rolf's survival? Great friends. I had great friends in high school, but they didn't come. They spent a ton of time with me when I was really sick, not in the hospital. I was, I'd be home for 4 months or something, and I couldn't go to high school, and because I was so sick I couldn't go. They wouldn't come to see me in the hospital, and in part, it was an hour and a half away, and they had their own lives, and they had part-time jobs, and they were trying to. But I did say to one of my friends, why don't you come to see me in the hospital? And he just said, I don't like to see you that way. And there's nothing wrong with that. He didn't want to see me connected to all the wires and tubes and like sort of drugged up on morphine and, home, come. But that's just normal. We don't want to go. We don't want to show up. It's okay. But then you show up anyway. And you say, I love you. This sucks. I brought you some Cheetos.
And you don't tell them about how your cousin Eddie died horribly from a disease.
Oh, maybe you do. I don't know, but I don't know your cousin Eddie. Like, so this past, my mom's had a first cousin named Paul, who many years later, my first call as a pastor was to be associate pastor to him. Paul was a pastor. I didn't really know him. I'm 50 years old, in the hospital. My right leg suddenly amputated, and mom's cousin Paul comes to see me in the hospital. I don't think I'd ever met him before. If I had, I didn't care. I was 15. I come from a very large extended family, and my mom's cousin comes in. His name's Paul Rowe. I love that man. He comes in and goes, do you play cribbage? You know I play cribbage? And I'm sure he knew already I did, right? And I said, yeah, I know how to play cribbage. I'm in my bed, hospital bed, the little table that swings over. And he goes, well, I brought a cribbage board. Would you like to have a game of cribbage? So we played a couple games of cribbage. He kicked my butt. And then after establishing the relationship through just a couple games of cribbage, he goes, well, how you doing? If he had come into the door and sat down and said, hi, I'm your mom's cousin. How are you doing? I would have blown him off, right? But he established a little bit of relationship, not much. Let's have a couple games of cribbage. And then he said, how you doing? And what I remember is he showed up. He didn't try to say anything profound, but he was there. And by the way, his daughter was named Gail. She was the head nurse at the peds floor in Mayo Clinic. I was eventually her patient, and then she died suddenly at age 34. And years later, I could say to him, "How you doing? You know, your daughter died," and it all comes in a big circle.
One of the elements that shows up in a bunch of stories, and I think it's in part because each of you are, you have your first person version, but you also have the experience of each other, is the narratives around the suffering of caregivers, whether it's, siblings, friends, partners, spouses, these kinds of things. What elements of the suffering and struggle caregivers have that are often unacknowledged in a memoir like this, or in conversations, because the person suffering the most tends to get the attention? Like, what particular elements of it do you think are kind of important to voice and kind of raise? Obviously, there's plenty more in the book about it.
Yeah, well, so what we do in the book is we each tell, our chapters are diagnosis, treatment, survival, milestones and meals, laughter, thriving, death. Even these are the chapter titles, and we each tell our own story. And then I think the strength of the book then is that storytelling with theological reflection, right? Just so people understand. So one of the points that I make in the book especially is medical care doesn't always, but it can dehumanize people. And I wish I'd made this point more clearly in the book. And medical care can dehumanize the caregivers. So imagine yourself as an orthopedic surgeon. And what you do for 20, 30 years is 3 days a week, you cut people open. What does that do to your soul? As the person receiving the care, medical care dehumanizes, can dehumanize, because a part of humanity is, in my case, amputated, right? My legs are gone. That was part of my humanity. Now that's gone. But what does that do to the surgeon who amputates limbs for decades? So what's the Christian's response to that? It's to tend what is human. And then also that extends to, like you said, the family, the friends that go through it also, that part of their own self is caught up in this cycle of suffering and life. And how do you care? How do two parents with a child who's sick care for the child but each other and their own life? Yeah, that's a really good question.
Do you want to tell the rib story?
I do want to tell the rib story. So 1980, my right leg's suddenly amputated. A year later, my left leg has cancer, which had never happened before in the records. I don't think it meant it had never happened. It just had never happened before in any sort of record keeping system that the Western medical system had. And so they tried to save my left leg, which ended up being a mistake. They should have just amputated it and let me move on, but blah, blah, blah. So I'm in the hospital. Actually, I was in the sort of what became the Ronald McDonald House for cancer kids, but at that time was called the Northland House. And I'm getting radiation on my leg, which they're going to do before they try to save the leg, which didn't work. And during this time, so my dad's a parish pastor, so my dad would have to work, and my dad had Mondays off. So he'd preach Sundays and have Mondays off. And so my mom would be with me Tuesday through Saturday. And then I would be alone Saturday night, and then Dad would come Sunday for a couple days for a night, and so it was a Sunday, and my dad was down to eat with me. He says his best friend was named Jerry, who was a great, great human being, and he says Jerry Larson is coming down, and he's going to take us to dinner. And I was so sick, you have to understand. They're trying to save this leg that's just shot full of cancer. And Dad says, I said, Dad, I feel terrible. I'm not going to dinner. You guys go and have a good time. Well, Jerry was this unbelievably enthusiastic personality whom I loved dearly. And he shows up and he goes, what do you mean you're not coming to dinner? We're going to dinner. And I'm like, then I don't want to go. Oh, we're going to dinner. And they forced me to go to dinner. And I was so angry. I was like a wet duck, just ticked off. And I don't even know what a wet duck looks like, but I was ticked. I was so angry that I was being forced to go to dinner. I felt terrible. We get to this restaurant. He took to a restaurant north of Rochester, Minnesota, where the Mayo Clinic is, called the Fisherman's Inn. We get in there. I'm in a wheelchair with my leg extended out in a locked position because it can't bend anymore. And the waitress comes over, and this is an old-fashioned rural supper club, polyester uniforms. And the gal said, well, what would you have? And he goes, how are your ribs? Our ribs are good. He goes, no. How are your ribs? And she goes, our ribs are good. He goes, you're not getting my question. I want to know how your ribs are. If your favorite uncle were coming to town, and when you were a little girl, he did anything for you. You needed him, he was there. And his favorite food was ribs. And he's coming to town tonight at this restaurant. Would you let him eat your ribs? And she goes, I would insist he have our ribs. And Jerry goes, we're all having ribs. You're laughing, right? Of abundance. Okay, theologically, let's talk about it. It was a moment of abundance. It was a moment of creating something wonderful from. And by the way, and so then I was a kid, so I had a Pepsi. My dad and his buddy Jerry each had a beer, and that moment, that nothing was going wonderful. In the words of Psalm 23, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemy. The enemy is cancer, and Jerry prepared a table before me. It was great, and it was so wonderful. It was the best moment of the worst part of my life. And here's the best part. Never mentioned it again. Never talked about it with Jerry, never talked with Dad. So 10 years later, I was coming up on the 10-year anniversary of my cancer. So now we're in 1990. I had a new girlfriend that my parents had never met. And I'm a senior in seminary. And I called up my dad and I said, hey, we're going to hit the 10-year anniversary of my cancer. Do you remember we had that dinner at the Fisherman's Inn? I would like to meet you there and to mark the 10-year anniversary. Let's go to that restaurant. And do you think Jerry was the guy, and his wife's name Jean. I said, do you think Jean and Jerry would like to join us? My brother Carl was in China because he was foreign studies. He was a Chinese major in college. So he wasn't there, but my two sisters joined us. And on the way there, my new girlfriend goes, why are we doing this? And I told the story about Jerry I told the whole story, right? And the whole speech. So we get there. It's 10 years later, never been mentioned. We get there. The waitress comes up and goes, well, what do you like to have? And Jerry goes, how are your ribs? He does the whole spiel again. If your favorite uncle, the whole deal. And then goes, we're all having ribs. And then he picks up the check for everybody, right? And then 10 years after that, and this is where the circle of sadness comes in. 10 years after that, same thing. I've now got I'm now married to my wife, who was not that girlfriend. My wife Amy was there. We have a daughter who's 1 year old. I don't remember. I don't remember if my daughter. We brought her to that dinner. Had a babysitter. I think we probably brought her. And now my brother's there. My good friend Hans and his wife are there. It's a different. We're not going to drive down to Rochester this time. We're all there, and same damn thing. Jerry starts with the whole spiel again with the waitress, would you let your favorite uncle have it? Now, this time the crowd is too big, so he didn't pick up a check. But he did say, I hope I'm here in 10 years. And he wasn't, because within a year he had died of his own cancer. I did the funeral. It's the whole cycle. And that's part of the chapter on meals and milestones. But to me, the brilliance of it is, how do you, in the words of Psalm 23, prepare a table in the presence of the enemy? It creates a place of honor. And so, yeah, to me, but my dad and I, on these occasions, we still celebrate these. I think it's important for people with whatever suffering, tragedy, things to remember the anniversaries and to mark them and not ignore them. And so, God willing, in 4 years from now or less even, I'll be coming up on a long time, another of those 10-year anniversaries, and my dad and I still will. My dad, who's 95 years old now, but Dad and I always then still order ribs.
Oh, no, that's awesome. I love that
But
story.
and so if you want to do something for somebody, right? Food, God blesses us. The Bible teaches us that God blesses us through the fruits of creation. I will prepare a feast for them. Isaiah 25. A feast of the best wine and the best meat, right? It's one of the things you can do when my father-in-law was dying, my brother-in-law and I were both his sons-in-law, we brought him some scotch, and we had bottle of scotch with him, you know, in the hospital. We didn't ask the doctors if it was okay. We just did it because it was, he was dying. There wasn't going to be any cure, you know, and so you find ways to bless each other.
We've talked about laughter and stuff on the podcast before,
Yeah.
but one of the bits that I don't think we've talked about that's in this book is where you connect the laughter of Sarah at God's promise to the name Isaac, right? And then argue that God was like, I'm going to build a joke into the covenant.
Yeah.
On behalf of every clergy that has to preach this text every 3 years, at least, if they have the lectionary, I'd love for you to unpack that, because I've heard some really bad sermons about that passage. And the moment laughter plays the role in the midst of God joining us in our suffering, I'm like, this will save a lot of people from listening to some rather mediocre sermons on it.
Well, both Abram and Sarah laughed at God. They're old. And the great thing about, especially, and I don't think we talk about it in this book as much as Carl and I do in our book called Divine Laughter, about that text is, the thing is, so when Sarah says, so, Abram goes out and meets the people and shows hospitality to strangers. And that's kind of where a lot of sermons stop. Oh, Abram, because Hebrew says, hey, people have entertained angels unaware, and they showed him hospitality. That's all true. That's a good sermon. But then Sarah laughs, and it says, the NRSV, and they say she laughed to herself. The Hebrew is she laughed in her belly. Translate that, she laughed in her womb. It's her womb, the source of her infertility. That's her pain. And so when God says, "Oh yeah, I'll be back in a year, and Sarah will have a baby," she laughed in her belly. It's both. It shouldn't be translated, she laughed to herself. It should be translated, she laughed a great, huge belly laugh. It's the source of her pain, And the human response to the promises of God, which are ridiculous. Forgiveness of sins? Are you kidding me? My sins can be forgiven? Life after death, right? And God goes, oh, no, 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 no. You're going to name your baby Laughter. Because God's job is to turn the cynical laughter of Friday when Jesus dies, the laughter of those mocking Jesus. Hey, he saved himself. No, he saved others. Can he save himself? Oh, he's calling Elijah. Maybe Elijah will come to save him. Right? And God's basic job description is to turn the mocking, disbelieving laughter of Good Friday into the laughter of Easter, the laughter of faith and joy and new creation. And that shows up in the way we respond to suffering. So, hey, I thought you might ask about laughter. So I'm ready with the quote from the book. Ready? And I'm going to quote not me, but something we quote in the book.
All right. See,
And
I
this is
thought
in the
you were about
chapter
to just
called-
dramatically read your favorite Norm Macdonald jokes. That's what I was anticipating.
You know, my uncle died of cancer, and he was talking about himself. He goes, they said he lost his battle with cancer. He goes, that's an odd thing to say of a guy who died of cancer. He was a loser. He goes, I think the cancer died at the exact same time my uncle died. I'd call it a draw. But, you know, what? Okay, death is real, but what a great way to flip your finger at cancer. So we quote Jerry Seinfeld in the book, in the chapter called Laughter. And he writes this. He was speaking commencement address to the students of Duke University. And he says, humor is the most powerful, most survival essential quality you will ever have or need to navigate through the human experience. I agree. Maybe not the most, but I'd say it's top 3. Humor as a way to deal with the worst things in life is crucial. And so now I'm going to go back to a part early in the book where my brother is reflecting on his experience. So Carl had leukemia, and the only cure for leukemia is a bone marrow transplant. So they kill your bone, they take radiation and chemo, and they kill your bone marrow because that's where leukemia is. And then you get a bone marrow transplant. Carl got it from my sister Ann. But they said, okay, we've killed your bone marrow, but before we can do the bone marrow transplant, if your type of cancer comes back, it comes back. Okay, by the way, we said early in the book, and I got this lesson from my friend Deanna Thompson. She has a cancer memoir, which is great, called Hoping for More. And she's got another one called Glimpses of Resurrection. And she says, like, okay, she told me, when you're doing this stuff, use the medical terms. Don't use euphemisms. Use the medical terms. So if you want to say penis, say penis. If you want to say testicles, say testicle. Right. So that's what we did in the book. Good advice from Deanna. And then she actually talked to me about this. So then Carl says, they said, before we can give you the bone marrow transplant, if your type of cancer comes back, it comes back with a vengeance in the testicles or in the brain. So we have to give you a full-on blast of radiation in your testicles. And in order to do that, he had to strip, lie naked on his back. They had to tape his penis, we're using the medical terms, to his stomach. Didn't take a lot of tape because he's a Jacobson, I'm just saying. And they blasted him for it took like 15 minutes for each test. So he's on his back naked for 30 minutes, right? And as he wrote, I've never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, so humiliating on display in my life. This is the dehumanizing part of medical care, right? And as I lay there, my mind racing with embarrassed, nerve-wracking energy, I kept saying to myself, I am as God has made me. I am as God has made me. And then he wrote, to add insult to injury, after it was over, the doctor informed me that the radiation treatment would eliminate any possibility of impregnation. So I guess all that money I spent on the vasectomy was wasted. That was Deanna wrote me. She goes, that was the point in the book when I really understood the humor part, which is, so you lay it out there. You're just unbelievably vulnerable. And then what you do, and you make a joke about it because it's your best defense against humiliation. And by the way, I love my publisher, Brazos Press, Baker Press, Brazos Press. I love them. They said, would you write a blog entry that we could share about the book? So I talked about that story. And then they wrote back and they go, oh, this is really good. Could you choose a different story? It's a little too raw. And I said, no, but I will change it. So then I wrote an extra paragraph. I said, is all this talk about penises and testicles making you uncomfortable? Just think about how uncomfortable Carl felt. Right? And then they were like, this is perfect. We're good with that. But, the idea is the impulse is to shut it down. Don't talk about this.
Yeah.
Just forget it. No. I don't want, no, stop it. Right? And to say, no, we're not going to avoid the incredibly uncomfortable moments. Laughter, I think, is one of our best coping devices.
The story of Carl made me think of the first time when I was a brand new minister. I mean, I was probably 20, and I go into the hospital because one of the other ministers on vacation or something, and the retired Army sergeant, when I come in, his butt is in the air and they're doing stuff to him in the room. And I'm, this is like my second or third time ever doing a visitation, and apparently my face was revelatory, and and he looks at me and he goes, I hope you have a great memory, because you're young enough. You got 60 years to savor this view. And I'm like sitting there like,
what a great sense of humor that dude had, man.
Yeah. And I have this face and I'm like, is he telling a joke? Because, I'm just shocked by all the pipes that are moving in and out of the guy, and there's multiple people working on him. And then he goes, but, yeah, don't laugh at me right now. But, once I'm back at church, you should bring this up around the old men. They'll think this is a great one, because I think only half of them have seen my ass. And they're like working on him, trying to like get stuff. He's like, I got a leaker. So they had to flip me, I was working at Rawls Baptist Church in Harnett County, North Carolina. It is a very rural area. And yeah, but I just remember it because the first time he's back at church, like after all of his surgery stuff, and he wasn't going to come back until he could wear his dress blues type thing, and he comes in all decked out again. And I was like, Sarge, am I supposed to wait until after church to make a joke about our interaction? And he's like, you can't make that joke in mixed company. You got to wait till like he's like, you can't make that in mixed company. And I was sitting there thinking, were you on so many drugs? Half the people that were poking on you were females,
Right. So, but like just in terms of jokes about how one of the things that I talk about in the book is I get stared at in public. I don't have legs, especially kids, right? But not just kids, people like give me the side eye and the stare. I've been in a wheelchair for 45 years. I don't notice it anymore, but each of my kids as they were growing up, and certain of my friends as they become friends of mine, but especially my kids, it really bothered them. And one time, so what are you going to do? My son says, Dad, doesn't it bother you how much they're staring at you? And I said, I guess, Gunnar, when you're this good looking, you just get used to it. So you make a joke about it, right? And then to learn to love crazy stuff kids say. And my favorite is, and I've heard it all, but I tell in the book is I was with my dad in a Target store in 1989. I remember almost exactly where we were. And this kid pulls around the corner and looks at me and goes, "Hey, Dad," he calls to his dad, "Look, someone's wearing a bike," which that's a pretty good description of what it means to be in a wheelchair. I'm wearing a bike, you know? And so even to this day on my Facebook profile, it's like, wearer of bikes. It's is one of my, I'm not Gandalf the Grey, with my long titles or arrogant. I'm Rolf Jacobson, wearer of bikes, which I think is just beautiful. You just gotta learn to laugh and roll with it, man. And by the way, when we do that, I deeply believe with Sarah that we are laughing as God is giving birth to the new creation. So the new creation, Sarah's laughter becomes Isaac's life. Jesus' death and the mocking laughter becomes Easter laughter. And when we laugh in some way, we are participating in the birth of the new creation. That's not bad, by the way. That's not a bad thing.
No. I support new creation.
Yep. And laughter.
And laughter. You talk at the beginning, there's this discussion of the origin of the book. You mention in it that you decided not to edit or update or change the voice and such of the parts your brother wrote. And then in chapter 6, you narrate, his own death. Yeah. And reading it, I got to hang out with both of you. But I wonder, and y'all are very close as brothers, like my brother and I. I know plenty of people who aren't besties by choice and brothers by birth kind of thing.
Yeah.
And for people that won't have the experience of getting the Carl and Rolf story time experience and seeing that in action, what's this story that shows up in it or that you think about to introduce your brother, whose words that are in the book are written before he knew what his end would be?
That's a hard question. First of all, I would want people to know that growing up, Carl's 4.5 years younger than me, 5 years in school. And that's a huge difference. So we were not close growing up because you can't be close. When I'm 9 and he's 4, when I'm 15 getting sick, he's 10. It's just such a vast, and I was much closer to my sisters, we have 2 older sisters. And so our closeness didn't happen until much later. So I just want to say that first of all, we were not close growing up. We were brothers, but we weren't tight. We're just too far apart. So if you don't feel close to your siblings or whatever right now, you might feel later, you know what I mean? And I want people to know it's not like he was a year younger than me. We were close all our lives. That was not it. We really became close. Carl was the willing partner in a divorce. And especially after that divorce, then he lived pretty close to me. And then we really became very close. And that was only probably 12 years before he died. So especially those last 12 years, we became very close, and we wrote a lot and we shared. We were both Old Testament scholars and so on. But the closeness, that you got to experience and that we experienced with you, and we were both close to you, in part just came from this sense of God's indwelling with us. If I can suck up to you for a moment, which I'm sure won't bother you. You have this great phrase in one of your books, the God who will not be God without us. Hats off. By the way, what book of yours is that in?
I know it's in Divine Self-Investments in chapter 5, because when you asked where it was, I was like Googling myself.
But it's such a brilliant phrase. God who will not be God without us. The God who is so committed to us that God will meet us in our suffering, because God could just say, you know what? Y'all are a bunch of sinners. Creation is broken. I don't want to be part of it. I'm going to go somewhere else. But the God of the Bible, who's revealed to us in the Bible, says, I will not be God without you. And therefore, for those of us who are grasped by the truth of that promise, then what does it mean for us to be there for each other? If God will not be God without us, then is it possible for us to be us without each other? The answer is no. The only way for us to be us is to be us together. And I think that's the message that Carl and Mike and I. And so, all right, can I tell you, here's the whole sense of humor and love and everything else. Ready? So the third author, we haven't talked about him enough, and that's not fair. Mike Pancoast, our buddy he was diagnosed with lymphoma a couple weeks before Carl, and then that was the side by side. So as you and I are podcasting this, last Friday, I met for happy hour with Mike, my friend, the co-author, and a mutual friend of ours named Hans Weersma, who actually preached the funeral sermon for Carl, which is included in the epilogue of the book. And it was a great funeral sermon. And the three of us are there at our favorite local Friday afternoon spot. And Mike says to me, hey, don't spread this around, but I've been having back pain for the last 3 days. And chapter 1 in Mike, when Mike tells his story of diagnosis, he had been ignoring back pain because he thought it was because he was sleeping on bad mattresses at, Bible camp because he's a pastor. And it turned out it was lymphoma. So he says, last Friday, I got back pain. And I said, oh man, that's going to make a great second edition. And Mike's response was, that was my thought exactly. He said, no, by the way, here's the good news. The good news is I said, you get yourself to your doctor. Do not mess around. And his oncologist bumped him up to Monday morning. Boom, he's good. He goes, no sign of cancer. Blood works good. Might be kidney stones. And I said, hey, Mike, praise the Lord for kidney stones. It's not lymphoma. And it's not kidney stones either, by the way. But that's the sense of humor, right? That's the love the three of us, Mike and Carl and I, have, which is that when Mike goes, man, I got back pain, I'm like, oh man, that's going to make a great second edition. And we all laugh.
Okay, the last thing I don't want to not talk about is the bit on Psalm 118, where this is the day the Lord has made, and you do the reading of the psalm and through the lens of Palm Sunday, or one of you did. But it has a kind of double meaning to map onto the experience there. You're thinking of survivorship and living in the aftermath of these experiences, as each of you lived in the aftermath of each other's different experiences, and everyone does, and then going through it. So, like, how does the Palm Sunday Psalm 118 thing help think through that?
So the question is the translation, first of all.
Right.
My dad's best friend, Jerry, who I talked about earlier, who meant so much to me, and whose funeral I eventually then preached at, like within a year of when he said, I hope I'm here in 10 years. His favorite verse from the Old Testament was, this is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. That was great. He wanted to, like, every day be positive, be joyful, right? And if you look at the text, and by the way, I have in my office at Luther Seminary, I have a little plaque that Jerry's widow gave to me when Jerry died, about that verse, right? with that verse in it. If you look at it, the question is, this is the day the Lord has blank. Let us rejoice and be glad in. And then the question is, how do you translate? And if you look at it in context, it should be translated. And I deeply and believe this, along with several other major Psalm scholars that I know. It should be translated and read it in context. This is the day the Lord has acted or done something. Let us rejoice and be glad in him. This is the day. The in it could be the day, but it's much more likely in context to be, let us rejoice and be glad in the Lord, in him. And you and I have talked about this on a previous podcast about the worst translations that, Bible scholars want to wreck. Didn't we talk about this before? I think like years ago.
I think we talked about it when we did the
10 things you learn that are kind of
yeah.
awful but awesome, that thing or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's the general context is let us rejoice and be glad in the Lord, because the Lord is acting. I don't think it's a bad thing to think about each day. And I remember when this is probably the first time we ever podcasted together, and you were like, oh, this is the day the Lord has made. This is an affirmation of the sacramental potential of every moment of being. Does that sound like something you'd say?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But that's actually not what the verse is about.
Well, it should be.
It should be, right?
But the bit you do in the book, based on my notes when I read it a while ago to write the endorsement, I said, this is what I wrote to myself, is I love the play of the double meaning, hooking it back to thinking of the Hosanna on Palm Sunday, where the cry, Hosanna, turns out to be both like a joyful cry and a cry for help. And I love that in like thinking about like, in that section of thinking about survival or living in the aftermath, where the gift of that passage, right, opens up to be able to use the psalm, and the psalm now has the ability of incorporating more of our own lived experience in it, as opposed to being like a protest to the facing of reality. And then Hosanna on Palm Sunday is both like a shout for joy, like he's entering, there's just going on, and we rehearse it every year, and when in context of the bigger story, it's also a cry for help. And I'm like, oh, yeah,
because originally in the psalm it's a cry for help. By the New Testament, when they're using it, it's a cry of praise. Hosanna, Hoshiana, save us, O Lord. But then it becomes Hosanna. It's a song of praise. And so, so to me, that's the importance, is just whatever verse of the Psalms you're praying, the language itself is not as important as the mood from which you're saying it. So that a word of praise can be a word of prayer. A word of prayer can be a word of praise. And it's all about the context from which you are addressing God. This podcast, you're generous enough to invite me to talk about this book, but I do want to I want to throw some sunshine your way. When you were up here for beer camp in St. Paul, Minnesota, fall of 2025, you had a brilliant sermon on Zacchaeus, where you talked about how you said to the audience, man, listen, the algorithms on the internet are colonizing you to keep you angry at your neighbor. And when they are successful, then you cannot see your neighbor is created in the image of God and the bearer of God's presence to you. And Jesus comes to Zacchaeus and sees him because he's not being colonized by the algorithms. and can actually see his neighbor. The algorithms on the internet prevent us from seeing each other as neighbors. That was a brilliant sermon, by the way. And the good
Thank you.
news is, of course, first of all, God sees you.
And it's gotten so much better since then. Just, as a nation, we're just really
Okay,
embracing the
dude,
neighbor more.
this is not about, you have no control over, as you have no control over the nation. You have no control over society. And Christian pastors shouldn't think they do.
Really?
Christian preachers should not think they do. I mean, you got no power. What you do have as the power is to announce the kingdom of God and the action of the triune God in Jesus Christ to meet us and go, you know what? You are not what the algorithms tell you you are. Your neighbors are not what the algorithms say your neighbors are. So I'm so grateful for that quite brilliant sermon. And I was there to hear it and be blessed by it. So I hope everybody goes to beer camp.
Oh, it's going to be fun this year. And
It's always fun. And
yeah,
certain people, by the way, were scandalized by the fact that you
well,
drank beer while you preached.
they really went to the wrong event if they were worried about that.
They went to the wrong event.
I don't even know
Nobody
if I
I knew,
cursed.
by the way.
The whole end of it, the first year it started, I I thought I was going to get like 15 to 30 people and we were going to go to different breweries and I was going to get a different
Yeah, that'd be
theologian to
cool.
go to one.
I would have come to that.
And then I opened it and then sold more tickets. I was like, I can't rent vans for this many people. So then I just kind of invented the event and kept doing it. And
Yeah.
the first year, I'm just, how do I even structure this? So I'm like making stuff up and then I'm like, okay, we got to do a closing. And I'm like, well, I'll just do a closing toast. And I don't think about it's a closing. And I get up there to do a toast to end. But, I drank enough and the Holy Ghost had touched me. And, it doesn't take much for a Baptist to start going. So for probably the first 7 years, the schedule would just say the closing toast, but have like an hour block. and then after lockdown, people were like, "You're still going to do the closing sermon?" I was like, "No, I don't do sermons at beer camp." And they're like, what do you call the thing where you talk at the end?" They were like, "I'm pretty sure it's a sermon." So then I was like, "Oh, I guess that is what I'm doing." But the first year, I wasn't that mature then, Rolf. I'm like, we're gonna do toast to 3 people, and I have these like setups, and I get to the last one, and I do this bit on Jesus being the cootie collector, and the whole bit is like there are actually no cooties, and like so I do this whole thing and like God refusing to be God without us, and I was like, so we're gonna end Theology Beer Camp. We're throwing up. This is our last toast to Jesus, motherfucking Christ, and
You did that.
I did, and then everyone was just like, yeah, and there's people that have come to all of them that keep going like after it they'll walk up and be like, that was really good, just didn't have that pop like that first year.
By the way, I want to give a call out of tribute to our mutual friend, Tony Jones. As Carl had gotten declared cancer free, and I went up to spend a couple weeks with Carl and my dad at my dad's cabin, I was reading Tony Jones's heartwarming memoir of leaving the church called The God of Wild Places. So shout out to Tony Jones and his book, which really helped. I had always said I wouldn't write this book, like you said, and then a couple things happened that helped me think, oh, we could write it. One was I read Tony Jones's book, and I thought, oh, if we structured this like Tony's book, and he had his, like, I don't know, do you remember how many, there are 8 chapters in his book or something? There's like, loss and fear and, degeneracy, and he dying of white people being wealthy. That was one chapter, right, Tony? Tony comes from the most hated, wealthy white suburban of Minnesota called Edina. Anyway, the way Tony structured his book really helped me figure out how to do this in a way that would be constructive and life-building. I want to thank Tony for that. Just want to make sure I name him as a primary influence on this.
Well, there are worse people to influence you, but they're definitely better. That's
not many. There's worse people, but just a handful. Tony Tripp said that, not me.
Oh, yeah. There you go. All right. This is fun.